First cousin marriages kill and disable children. This isn't just my opinion, guys, this is fact. Backed by extensive scientific data, and it's back in the headlines again this week. Why? Well, the NHS England's Genomics education programme recently published guidance that says that first cousin marriage is linked to stronger extended family support systems and economic advantages. Hold on a second. So a practice that produces badly disabled children, many of whom die shortly after birth, is now being described as acceptable because it brings economic benefits? That doesn't sit right with me, and I'm certain it doesn't sit right with most of you out there either. I do have a lot to say about this, and so should anybody with any moral compass. Why is this still legal in the UK? Earlier this year, Richard Holden, MP, called for first cousin marriages to be banned in the UK. And yes, believe it or not, it is definitely still legal to marry your first cousin in the UK. Most people don't even know this. For me personally, it's uncomfortable. My first cousins are like my siblings. I couldn't imagine marrying one. But beyond personal feelings, this issue is about protecting children from harm. What do people say? What is the opposition to banning it? Well, there are a range of arguments against banning cousin marriage. Some say the state shouldn't interfere in private personal decisions about marriage and relationships. Others argue that this is an attack on minority ethnic communities and their culture. I'll come back to those arguments later. But first, let's be very clear. The NHS should never promote or normalise a practice that causes serious disability or death in children if it can be avoided. Why would the NHS endorse or accept anything that increases the chance a child may suffer when they pledge to protect health and well-being? That is the fundamental question. I imagine they feel emboldened by the Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who, when this topic comes up for debate, whips his MPs to block it. So we know where Keir Starmer stands. This is a doctor's perspective. Mine comes from first do no harm. As a doctor, I've got a responsibility to reduce pain and suffering wherever I can. And there's plenty around without something that we know increases the risk. Children don't choose to be born. And when they are, we should all want the best possible chance for them to live happy, healthy lives. That means preventing avoidable harm wherever possible. That's my job. Cousin marriage, unfortunately, leads to far more cases of severe disability and infant death than other legal relationships. The science is very clear. Cousin marriages are risky for the children born of it. This comes down to genetics. Many of us carry one defective gene for a serious disease. Take sickle cell anemia or cystic fibrosis, for example. As long as your partner doesn't carry the same defective gene, your children won't inherit the disease. But if your partner does carry the same defective gene, something much more likely if you're closely related to that partner, like first cousins, there's a 25% chance your child will inherit the disease. This is called a recessive genetic disorder. This is why we can't marry close family members like siblings or parents. The risk is simply too high. And first cousins are the closest relatives legally allowed to marry in the UK. And it's just an anomaly that a law that has overlooked as the science has developed. Let's look at the Bradford study, the hard data. There are very clear facts from the Bradford study, one of the largest and most detailed studies on this issue, conducted between 2007 and 11. 13,000 children born in Bradford, and they compared the health outcomes based on whether their parents were related. The results are shocking and clear. Children born to first cousin parents have double the risk of birth defects compared to the general population. Double. The risk was about 6% compared to 3% overall. Cousin marriages accounted for nearly 1/3, 31%, of birth defects in Pakistani origin parents in Bradford. The infant mortality rate for children of cousin marriages in Bradford was approximately 6 per 1,000 live births compared to 4 nationally, a 50% increase. But it isn't just Bradford. A BBC Newsnight report found that Pakistani communities, who make up 3% of UK births, account for almost 1/3, 31%, of children born with disabilities in the country. This means children born into these communities are 13 times more likely to have a disability than average. In Birmingham, when nearly half of mothers are married to a close relative, that's right, half of mothers in Birmingham are married to a close relatives, 1 in 10 children from cousin marriages dies in infancy or lives with a serious lifelong disability. Another NHS-funded study, the Enhanced Genetic Services Project, found that in Birmingham, deaths due to genetic disorders linked to cousin marriages were 38 times higher than among white European babies. This has real-life impact, human costs. Numbers are powerful, but let me be clear. Behind every statistic is a child and a family. I have worked in hospitals with large South Asian communities. It was drummed into us that a really important question when taking a history on paediatrics and gynecology was, are you related to your husband by anything but marriage? I kid you not. In this role, I saw children unable to speak, fed through tubes, ventilated, often hospitalised for months or even years. Many of these children never return home. The families, however, do return home, and they have more children, desperately trying to have a child without a disability. And I have, as a result, seen several siblings from the same family on the hospital wards suffering. And it didn't need to happen. For the children who don't go home, their families face enormous challenges. Daily nursing, frequent hospital appointments, schooling, constant emotional and financial strain. The cost to the child, to the family, and to you and I, the taxpayer, is huge and lifelong. But despite all of this data, and the children languishing on NHS wards that they clearly know about, the cost to everyone, and this recent NHS guidance seems to soften its stance, highlighting supposed economic and family benefits of cousin marriage over disabled children. It's sickening. Remember, the NHS warns pregnant women not to eat prawns to protect their babies against the vanishingly rare food poisoning, so rare in fact that there's no reliable data on women affected by it. And yet it appears comfortable with a practice that doubles birth defects and accounts for 31% of birth defects in towns with high Muslim populations. A contradiction I find shocking, but sadly not surprising. So, is this about political correctness, appeasement? I fear that this can be the only answer. But children's health must always come first, surely, but not according to this NHS guidance. Now, I said I would come back to this guidance and the arguments being used to support this barbaric, outdated and cruel practice. And make no mistake, the cultural context and political debate conversation is difficult to have. Firstly, some people defend cousin marriage as a cultural practice. And yes, it is part of tradition in some Muslim, Orthodox, Jewish and traveller communities. But culture should never trump a child's right to a healthy life, should it? Independent MP Iqbal Mohammed acknowledged the suffering but still argued against banning cousin marriage, calling instead for education. To me, this is not only immoral, it's dishonest, and said knowing that education is not and will never be enough. It also hides his needs to appease his voter base rather than stop children's suffering. A political stance to avoid upsetting voters while damaging children is never acceptable. I wonder how dead and disabled children would feel if their chance to a better life could have been created by a simple law change, and cultural sensitivity should never win. This is the UK in the 21st century and you are here. It is stop with the it is racist. There are, as I have said, white communities doing this as well, Jewish and traveller, and I apply it to all of them. It is, of course, important to acknowledge that cousin marriage was practiced in Britain historically, but it died out by the early 18th century as science showed the dangers. We evolved. Other communities must be able to evolve too. Now, what about the state shouldn't interfere in private personal decisions about marriage and relationships? The state shouldn't interfere. What? Marriage is a state-regulated institution. We can't marry our siblings or our parents by law. Why not first cousins? Why are first cousins any different? The law already steps in to protect children from harm in so many ways. Banning cousin marriage would simply extend those protections. And never forget, many of these marriages are forced or at best arranged. We usually seem really concerned about such oppression and abuse of women. And I accept, of course, that not all of them are, but some are. I witnessed it with my own eyes when a doctor in the East End of London. Cousins are flown in from Pakistan, Bangladesh to marry a first cousin and often are desperately unhappy. They sometimes find themselves married to a man with severe mental health issues, already a product of a first cousin marriage, or into a domestic violence scenario. Now, I know that women of all cultures can find themselves in domestic violence scenarios, but at least they had time to get to know and choose their husband, and they weren't forced there to start with. And perhaps they would have declined to marry the one with severe mental health problems given the option. So in the face of all this, the NHS's stance is alarming at best, wicked and political at worst. Protecting children must be our priority. Must be our priority. We must not let cultural sensitivity or political convenience blind us to the suffering caused by cousin marriage. This is about children's lives, preventable disability and death, families broken by avoidable tragedy, a strain on the NHS and society. We owe it to future generations to have this honest conversation, to educate, and yes, to legislate. It's necessary. The status quo is unacceptable. It's time to put children's health and well-being above culture, tradition and politics. Richard Holden MP will be bringing this subject back to Parliament, so write your MP. Ask them to support it. I do.